Good morning and welcome back to Jack's Coffee Break. My name is Jack. Today we are back in Planet Zoo with a tutorial that I think I've talked around but have never actually done anything about. I'd like to thank Lorelion for this suggestion because it didn't even occur to me that this needed a video, and I'm really glad they did because it absolutely does. We are going to be talking about material and color in Planet Zoo. How do you begin to select the materials that you're going to use? How do you choose your color palettes? What goes into designing a color palette? And how do the materials that you're using affect the colors that you can expect? And then, of course, also, sort of on a grander scale, what does this say about your world building? Now, we have talked about world building in like an hour and a half long video before. We have talked about materials and style and things like that in some of the earlier tutorials where I talk about, making like two-story buildings and getting started and multi-story buildings, all of those. But we're going to talk about specifically just focusing in on like, how do you pick your material? How do you pick your colors? So let's start with materials, right? So the first thing that you need to consider is, where is your zoo? A zoo that is set in like the Mojave Desert is going to be drawing on a completely different set of rules than one built in the jungles of Peru, for example. They're just going to be fundamentally different. This is because of the cultures, the climate, the environment, the rainfall, all those sorts of things, and those are going to play a huge role in selecting your materials. So let's start with fairly easy, right? On a scale of rural to urban, where is your zoo? Is it near like a small town, or is it in a big city? Rural constructions are almost always, with exceptions we'll talk about, they're almost always going to draw on the natural resources of wherever you are. So if you're in a desert, you're probably going to be building out of mud and stone, unless that desert is lush and happens to have a lot of trees or woody plants that you can kind of use for some kind of building material. If you're in a modern setting, you might expect to be able to import more quote-unquote exotic materials, or be able to use quote-unquote more exotic materials. For example, glass and metal. Even if you are building a zoo that is set in the far past, for example, just for kicks and giggles, you are going to be able to use metal, but it's going to be a lot harder to work with that material, so you're not going to have a lot of it. It's mostly going to be for like your decorations. It's not going to be what the foundation of your building is, or the walls or the framing of your building is going to be made out of. It's not going to be what your roofs are made out of. Same thing for glass. Glass is very delicate, very difficult to work with, and so most of the time when we see glass work, the biggest that we're going to get are going to be like window panes. So don't use a whole lot of glass in those situations. Instead, use like wood, stone, plaster, mud. And then, as you move forward in the timeline, think about maybe adding metal as a framework because it becomes cheaper and easier to import. Start thinking about using concrete, right? So that's going to be one of the big things to think about, is when is your zoo set? Where is your zoo set? If you are in the middle of a jungle, or in the middle of a swamp, and you're dealing with a lot of rainfall, then all of a sudden you have the elements that you need to think about. So mud is going to work great if you're in a desert because it then hardens into a kind of stone-like material. It's fairly easy to maintain, to rebuild. It's not going to crumble on you very hard. It's not going to crumble on you very much, which is why, a lot of the American Southwest, a lot of the old buildings were made out of plaster. That's why. This is not going to fly if you are in Brazil, for example. If you are in a place with a lot of rainfall where where the mud never gets a chance to harden and dry, all of a sudden it's not a very good material to work with, so you want to start thinking about using wood. If you are sort of more towards the eastern side of Asia, or really in any part of Asia that is south of probably Mongolia, you can start thinking about bamboo. And as you move farther in the timeline into the modern day, you can also start thinking about adding bamboo to just about everything. Bamboo is like wood in that it's very sturdy. You can build frameworks out of it. It's very easy to grow, to replicate. It's faster than wood, even at that. And so it's a very sustainable material. So if you're wanting to think about the sustainability of your zoo, you're going to lean more on bamboo, and then after that, you'll think about your wood, right? Wood is very good as like a generalized building material when you need to get something built fast and affordably and in a situation where you need to be conscious of your resources, right? So, for example, most houses these days are made out of wood, certainly in America. And then, moving back in the timeline, a lot of castles used to be built out of wood first, and then they would receive stone replacements later as the castle eventually turned into proper hamlet, or as the duke or whoever was running it got richer and were able to replace portions of their castle with more hardy materials like stone. But initially they would be built out of wood. Again, cheap, easy. Wood is also good for several kinds of constructions because it withstands moisture a lot better. It is able to deal with being dried out a lot easier. It eventually petrifies, and so that makes it a stronger building material. It is by far the most flexible of the materials that we have to work with. If you're ever in doubt, you probably want to start with wood and then layer on plaster. And then after that, start thinking about, if you're really late in the timeline, if you're like in the modern day, then you can start thinking about like cheap, easy metal prefabs. Those are going to be kind of a good intermediary where, you don't really have the time to build a custom wooden construction, you just need to get something built right now. You're going to go with a metal prefab because all of those things, because of, the trade network that exists, you're going to be able to pull a prefab way faster. Plaster is not actually a building material in itself, even though Planet Zoo treats it like it. Plaster is always a covering on top of a structure. It's usually used for aesthetics, insulation, decoration, durability, which is why most buildings have plaster on their walls, even if that's not actually what they're made out of. So it's always good to draw on that. If you're like, this interior doesn't feel the way that I feel like it needs to, you're probably missing plaster. That's probably what that feeling is. Next up, we have things like concrete, and then kind of circling back to metal. So concrete is sort of this in-between from stone and plaster. It's more durable than plaster, but not as much as stone. It's lighter than stone, but it's heavier than plaster. And so concrete is really good when you need to get something laid out fast and quickly that you can repair easily and that will hold a lot of weight for a very long time, which is why, most of our cities are paved in concrete. However, concrete does not like to be stood up. There needs to be a good, strong framework. You can build concrete walls, but they're going to be thick. And usually they've got some kind of internal lattice framework, some kind of metal framework that they're actually like using as the concrete structure, right? So that's going to be something to consider. Concrete is always going to want to sort of melt towards the earth. Stone is always going to be heavy. It's always going to go towards the earth. Metal can be kind of anything. It's by far the most flexible of all of the materials we have on the list, but all of the ways that we use it are extremely modern. If you want to go for an older aesthetic, limit it to your decorations. If you want to go for a newer aesthetic, and especially an urban aesthetic, use it for everything. Build all of your buildings out of metal, and then sort of fill in the gaps with things like plaster and glass and concrete and things like that. Especially if you're dealing with like new, richer upper end buildings, like high rises and stuff like that, metal is going to be your best friend. All right, so let's talk about some general rules for weight. In general, you always put your heaviest materials at the bottom and your lightest materials at top. So, for example, you never put a stone structure on top of a wooden frame. Like, you wouldn't do that. But then there's some other considerations you got to think about. So, for example, what is your ground type? And you don't need to like deeply research this, just kind of come up with it for yourself. So, for example, like if you're building on a floodplain, like maybe you're building a wetland zoo, you're probably going to want to build most of your buildings up on stilts, or you're going to want some kind of foundation that drills into the ground. Maybe not necessarily like a basement, but just something that's going to give that building stability. If you want some really cool inspiration, I would suggest looking up cranogs. Hopefully I've got one on screen here, but they're a like old, like pre-Scottish, I think, construction. Where they would burrow these massive, like, trunks of trees into the bottoms, like, stacked on top of each other, onto the bottoms and into the subsurface of the lakes. And then they would use that in order to create a platform that they would build a kind of circular house on top of. It was really cool. We see something similar to this in, like, beach houses, where, you know, they'll be up on stilts, and those stilts will drill into the ground deep enough to where you know, you're going through the sand to where it stops shifting so much. And then you build your house on top of those stilts. So that might be something to consider, especially if you're in like a high flood risk area or a high rainflow area. That's going to be something that you might want to do. Otherwise, the way that you deal with it is you build like routes, I guess, for water to flow through. So maybe you build canals, maybe you build drainage ditches, maybe you've got all of your buildings sort of up on a rise and then goes down into the street, and then the street kind of channels all the water through. So those are other ways that you can kind of work with whatever water system you're dealing with. If you were working in a particularly hot area, like a desert, you're also going to be wanting to think about your shade structures. So this is another place where, like, we don't really think about it, but outside of buildings, there's a whole bunch of other construction that goes into creating a zoo and making it look like a lived-in place. And part of this is going to be your lighting and your shade structures. So, shade structures can also work for, again, heavy rainfall areas, heavy snowfall areas, to try and give your guests a break from those weather effects. So you'll want to build some of those into your constructions as well, places for people to hide during inclement weather, or to warm up, or to cool down, or whatever. Those will just add a little bit more life. Lastly, we got to talk, at least in the material section, we got to talk about the size of your building, right? So very, very small buildings are going to be made usually pretty cheaply. They're intended to serve a simple purpose. So think about your garden shed. That's kind of the size that I'm talking about here. Just something where you put your tools, or you put a bench or something. It needs to be out of the elements, but it doesn't necessarily need to, like, withstand the test of time. That's not the goal. Those are going to be made fairly cheaply and out of whatever the cheapest material is, while also being built extremely fast, so that way they can serve their purpose immediately. So you're probably not going to be building a stone garden shed unless you intend for the house that shed is attached to be there for years. Or you're building a cellar, for example. Likewise, with extremely large buildings, you're going to be building out of things that can withstand a lot of ground forces. So the ground is going to be shaking kind of wherever you are. In earthquake-prone areas, it's going to be extreme, but there's always going to be some amount of ground shift. And the larger that your building gets, the more that's going to affect the foundation. And if the foundation goes, the building goes with it. So you're going to be wanting to build out of extremely sturdy materials, and you're going to want to think about how you frame things so that way the stress of the building sits kind of above the ground or at surface level, not below the ground. Unless you're in a particularly stable area. All of those things are going to start to contribute to how your large buildings are going to be built, how wide they are, how tall they are. And of course, that's going to go into the materials. The larger the building gets, the more likely you are to be building with things like glass and metal. So let's talk about colors. The thing about color, right, is it is by far the most complicated subject we can possibly talk about. I have a script I'm working on for a potential different channel, just about what color theory is, why it works, and how we apply it. We're not going to be doing the deep dive into that right now. That just doesn't make any sense for Planet Zoo, but here are some general things to think about for your colors. So this is not a rule, but very frequently the trend is that the more vibrant of a location that you live in, the drabber the buildings usually are. And vice versa, the more plain an area is, the more drab it is, in general, the more colorful your buildings are going to be. Now, again, this is not a rule, but these two things tend to end up balancing each other out as like a general thing that happens. Obviously, there are exceptions to this. So, of course, you know, we can't forget about taste. Individual taste might dictate that even though you live in a tropical paradise, you have to deck your entire kingdom, or you have to deck your entire mansion with, like, bright red brick and gold flake everywhere, and there's gotta be 40 billion different colors on the inside. Like, these things exist. But in general, what tends to happen is that the more vibrant your outsides are, the more drab your insides are, and that highlights the vibrantness of the outside. So think, you're probably going to be building more in like the pavilion style. When you do build buildings, they're probably going to be kind of plain with a lot of windows facing out into the outside world to bring that color in, to give that sense of airiness and breeziness. Meanwhile, in a cold, snowy wonderland, the outside is usually cold and snowy, so there's nothing to look at. I mean, yes, the winter views of the night are gorgeous, and you probably want some windows in order to give that sense of space and airiness, but for the most part, those kind of buildings are going to be built tough, and they're going to be built thick in order to insulate and keep heat inside those buildings, and that means that you're not going to have a whole lot of windows, because windows are places where heat escapes from. Likewise, because you're going to be trapped probably in your town or in your house for a very long time, you want it to be vibrant and colorful and full of life to kind of counterbalance the emptiness that's surrounding you. Now, of course, what interrupts this? Main things to think about are going to be economic. So for example, when you're dealing with hypercapitalism, like America, usually what happens is that there is a specific template, and then everything is built to the template. So think, for example, Starbucks, right? Every single Starbucks looks the exact same. They may have a couple tweaks here, you know, a couple of aesthetic choices here, you know, something to make them fit into their space, but for the most part, every Starbucks looks like every other Starbucks. Every single McDonald's looks like every other McDonald's. So there's this standardization. They also tend to lean towards inoffensive colors, so they're usually neutrals, grays, you know, medium browns, not rich, sort of leaning towards, you know, where you can get sort of pastel-y. They're going to lean brown into gray into white and black, is usually where that color spectrum is going to be, so all those neutrals, which I should have on screen now. And then there will usually be some kind of accent pop of color. 1 to 3 is sort of the maximum. So for McDonald's, it's going to be, you know, the classic red and yellow. For Starbucks, it's going to be green. For Subway, it's going to be green and yellow. Very specific, poppy, usually like exactly what you would expect out of that color. It's sort of the most typical expression of it. You know, you're not going to get really kind of, you don't pull out the mauve very often unless you're working with a neutral. You're not going to pull out the like scarlet unless it's part of your branding. And so it should lean towards this very kind of samey cookie cutter while just having enough to differentiate it from the outside world that it kind of stands out. On the opposite end, when you get into sort of modern economic dictatorships, so think the Soviet Union, what you end up with is a focus on the cheapness of the materials and a lack of focus on culture, personal expression, and aesthetics. So I think the old Soviet blocks, which again I should have up here on screen, that is a product of economic control in which the individual's input is not valued. The same thing does happen in hypercapitalism, by the way. They both sort of tend to veer towards this, like, hyper-utilitarianism over the aesthetics and appeal to the individual. On the opposite end, you get really rich people in an area who just need to flaunt their personality, and so you end up with your color bomb in the middle of a tropical landscape, you know, or you end up with marble everywhere. Think old Renaissance palaces. When you're in a place of economic balance, aesthetic is mixed with culture, is mixed with utility. And so the three kind of blend together to make a very specific kind of unique style, which is what we see in older renditions of like Middle Egypt or Europe, period, or like China and Japan, especially that kind of like old Japanese shrine aesthetic or the old Japanese houses, all of that kind of stuff. That's this blending of aesthetic with utility with personal taste that makes for really beautiful architecture. So you find this kind of balance there. And then of course also you have to consider your scarcity of resources. So again, if wood is not available in your area, you're not building with wood, or you are building with wood and you're using it for very specific things. So you're not going to build your house out of wood, but you're probably going to build your table set out of wood. If metal is difficult to come by, you're going to use it for things that are easier to make. So, nails, jewelry, decorations, but you're not building entire buildings out of it. So what your material scarcity brings to the picture is also going to be the things that are going to act as sort of your visual pop in those areas. All of this is going to create a sense of texture. You want to balance texture. You don't want it to be one type of thing unless that is a specific aesthetic you're going for, like those old Soviet blocks. Everything is made out of concrete. There's no texture there. But there is a little bit of depth and variation that can add texture. So don't just plunk down a 4x4 out of concrete unless that is your intention. Add something to it. Add lighting, add gutters, add, unique doors of some kind, add windows. And then, what kind of roofing you need is also going to depend on what you need, and it's also going to lend some kind of visual interest to your building. Roofs are really good at adding that because they take up a ridiculous amount of space. For drier climates, you can go with a flat roof because you don't really need to channel a whole lot of anything. Wet areas, you can have flat roofs, but typically they come with a lot of drainage that's sort of built into the building. Otherwise, if you're going for like a snowy area, you want more peaked roofs because this is going to allow the snow to slide off of the roof. And you're typically going to use things like tile. Thatch is really good for when you have a high moisture environment, so snowy and tropical. For example, thatch is going to be the easiest thing to replace, so you're just going to replace it, and that's just going to be part of the cost of living there. Probably because, bringing in something like a tile roof would be more expensive. Likewise, if you're dealing with like a tropical paradise, you're dealing with a lot of rainfall all the time, and once again, it's easier to replace a thatch roof than it is to replace a rusted roof. Unless you're in a tropical urban environment, in which case it's easier to replace a rusted metal roof than it is to replace a thatch roof. So that's where ease of maintenance starts to play in. As for how you want to do your colors, it is honestly, a lot of it depends on your taste, right? So some cases the material is going to govern your color, and then you sort of pick a palette that goes off of that. In several cases, your foliage is going to determine your colors, and then you're going to go off of that. You're going to find things that you can take and blend and mix in to sort of give it that flavor, that flair. You can also choose to go off of specific aesthetics. So, for example, if you're building a European town-based zoo, you're going to have that kind of reddish-orange tile roof that is pretty much universal. It's going to be kind of a sign of effort that it's not that reddish-orange brick tile. Likewise, if the local area that you are building in you've decided has sandstone, you're going to be dealing with a lot of yellow. So you're going to want to use colors that are complementary to that particular color of yellow. Blues are always a winner. And this kind of goes into a little bit of color theory. And so for this, I actually have to pull out Krita, so give me a moment. Like any good star on HGTV, let's talk about our neutrals. So, neutrals are by far some of the most boring colors, but they're also some of the most important in your palette. And a lot of this comes down to the fact that the way that Planet Zoo builds its flexicolor patterns, you don't want to go hypersaturated most of the time, or when you do, it's because the flexicolor itself is not pulling the true color. It's layering on top of a texture that already has some kind of value. And by value, I do mean on a grayscale sense. So your neutrals are basically like the foundation that everything else is going to get laid on top of. So most of your neutrals are going to be in a zone of the color wheel called your earth tones. So your earth tones are going to be this band here, from this sort of like neutral orangey yellow, not greeny yellow, but orangey yellow, down towards, not quite into the scarlets, but almost there. This whole band right here, this is your earth tones. And in fact, if I put my little selector right about here, you'll see that we cycle through a whole bunch of earth tones. That's what we're talking about here. So these are going to be your neutrals, and they are very, very useful. The main reason why, though, is because they're so bland, because they say nothing. So they act as a really nice canvas for you to then layer everything on top of. So your greenery is usually going to be way brighter than your neutrals, and so it's going to pop against those neutrals. Likewise, if you have, when we get into some of the actual, like, useful, like, colors, you know, the things that most people think about when they talk about color, they're all going to stand out farther on top of those neutrals, but it also gives the eye a place to rest. So this is really important when we talk about traditional art, but it's also true in architecture, where you're surrounded by a space. If you have to be surrounded by a color at all times, it needs to be something that doesn't say anything to you emotionally, so that way you can experience your own emotions. And the neutrals are really good at creating that. Of course, we also have our grayscale here, very useful. Just in general, your grayscale is, I mean, it's critical, but it's also a neutral. So you're going to end up using it quite a lot. On top of your neutrals, kind of adjacent to it, you have all of your wood tones. So in a very similar band, but a little bit wider. So from this orange, and I'm going to put it in like a middle dark, there we go. From this orange up into almost your greens, you have you have your wood tones. Now for most of the neutrals, we ride sort of in this space right through here on our color palettes. For earth tones, we're going to go a little bit deeper, so we can go all the way from, like, down in this region, all the way up into sort of pastels. It's this whole area, which you will see if I use my little color selector. You can see it moving around on that little dot right there. And then how they shift across the different spectrums. So over here in the sort of darker, richer area, this is going to be most of the wood tones that I use. They're very rich, very red, and I find that they complement really nicely in colder environments. So, you know, where you pull out your weathered wood, like your Arctic pack, for example. These are going to be all those red hues in there. Sort of next to that are going to be some of your more normal woods. So this is going to be everything from your beech to your oak to your sandalwood. Not quite into mahogany, but you know, most of those normal wood palettes that you would expect to decorate your home with, that's going to be this region right here. Then we get into sort of the tropical woods. So when we start to talk about like palms or light woods, that's going to be this region. So the lighter that you go, generally the more bright and welcoming the space is going to be. The darker that you go, you're going to need to offset with something like a white or a pastel or a more like a softer neutral, a softer, brighter neutral. And then down into the greens. So this is closer to what I would call like an untreated wood, or like a palm wood or something like that. That's going to be kind of down here. And then over here is the bamboo section. Bamboo, we treat it like wood, but it's really doing its own thing in the color space. It can be very rich and vibrant. It can be dead and dry. Bamboo is a grass, so it behaves like a grass, and you're going to pull all the standard colors that you would for that type of plant. Next, let's talk about Florida's favorite color palette, the pastels. If you're not going to have a neutral, you're going to have a pastel. And the reason why is that they're not so saturated that they're constantly vying for your attention, but they're also bringing color into a space. So again, the goal is to not overwhelm is generally the thing, because you have to be around this all the time, and so that sensitivity can eventually eat at you. And so pastels kind of mix between having actual color in a space and having the monotony of neutrals in that space, kind of blends the benefits of both of those two things together. So you end up with a lot of pastels. These are very popular in tropical environments and in more high-level urban environments. And typically they're projected as leaning more feminine, but I would argue that that actually depends a lot on your culture and the individual. I wouldn't tether anything to that. We do use them a lot in like spaces for babies. That's very common. So if you have like a kids play area, you probably want to lean into the pastels. And then over here, we have the fun colors. So we have your poppers and we have your tone setters. Poppers do exactly that. They're hyper-saturated colors that pop, that grab your attention. And so you're going to use these in places where you want that attention to be focused. So if you have like an environmental board, or you have like a caution area, or, you know, something like that, you know, maybe even a food area, you're going to use those poppers. Your tone setters are similar to the pastels in that they're pulling from the benefits of pastels, or they're pulling from the benefits of color, while also saying more than the neutrals. Your tone setters are good for establishing a tone, a vibe, a setting. And so if you want an area to lean into like a particular feeling, you're going to do that through your tone setter colors. And then after that, you'll layer on, you know, in tandem, you know, some more of your neutrals in order to create that vibe, as well as, you know, what kind of plants and wood you're going to bring in. And then you choose the specific color based on, you know, what you want a place to feel like. If you want it to be calm and relaxing, you're going to go with blues. If you want it to be very eye-catching, you're going to go with your reds and yellows. And if you want it to be kind of natural, you're going to go with your greens, your yellows, and maybe a little bit of light blues and cyans. Your purple is for fun. Usually this, again, ends up in kid spaces, but if you want to, like, broadcast that this is a place where we have fun, you're gonna bring in purple. So that is the basics of all the, like, cornerstones of the color theory, for Planet Zoo specifically. And especially when you're dealing with, like, architecture, natural spaces, anywhere where humans have bumped up against nature, this is kind of what you're looking at in terms of, like, your baseline palette and why. Now, obviously, you don't need to, like, pause the video and import it and color pull or anything like that. I mean, you could. You could, if you needed that. But in general, this is just sort of a guide. So, in general, you want to avoid your hypersaturateds unless the particular material that you're working with in Planet Zoo really needs it, or you need it for, like, a specific vibe. It's really good for signs to go saturated, but it's not good for, like, fencing to go saturated. All of your workaday stuff is going to be in this gray space, gray to neutral to pastel, some of your tone setters, all of that's going to be in this workspace. And then for your general colors, I would recommend that you stay in this band through here. Again, this is mostly because you kind of want to avoid oversaturated colors in general, unless you know that you have a reason for it, in which case you want that saturated color to be the thing that stands out. So for example, your neon signs, you pull into your saturated. For your advertisements, you pull your saturateds. For your artwork, you pull your saturateds. But maybe don't make your couch the brightest thing in the room unless you want your couch to be the only focus of the room. That makes sense? That makes sense. Okay, so that's generally materials and colors. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, anything like that, please drop them below and I will get to them when I can get to them. Probably won't be for a long while. I will talk about that announcement later. Anyway, y'all have a great day, stay safe, and happy building!